Hi, thanks for listening. Today I'll be presenting an overarching conceptual framework that we developed as part of the Gender, Climate Change, and Nutrition Integration Initiative, or GCAN, which is funded by the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. This framework has several versions, including one that takes a broad resilience lens, and we recently updated this framework to incorporate a food systems lens for a forthcoming chapter in an edited volume on resilience. And that is what I will focus on today. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Claudia Ringler and Ruth Meinsendick, who worked with me on this chapter. The original GCAN framework, shown here, highlights the linkages between climate change and other shocks and stressors, gender, and nutrition. This framework moves from top to bottom and back up again. It illustrates how the well-being outcomes of shocks and stressors are influenced by several intervening components listed here. Each of these components is gendered. For example, men and women may be differently exposed and sensitive to different shocks and stressors, depending on their livelihood roles and other factors. Similarly, men and women have different capacities to respond given their differential access to information, services, and assets, for example. Men and women also have different preferences for how they address disturbances. However, women tend to have less bargaining power and autonomy over decisions in the household and in their communities. So shocks and stressors and people's responses to them can lead to different outcomes for men and women, which then influences future resilience capacities. Other intersectional identities are also important, things like age, class, marital status, etc. But for the sake of simplicity, I focus primarily on gender differences in this presentation. The new chapter builds on this original framework by integrating a food systems lens. Specifically, the chapter integrates three main elements of food systems: food value chains, the food environment, and consumer behavior, elements that influence the ways in which shocks and stressors affect well-being outcomes. And the ways in which these elements interact in the framework is shown in the purple boxes. So for example, we point out that food environments and gendered roles along agricultural value chains can influence the level of exposure and sensitivity and resilience capacities to respond to disturbances. Men and women have different response preferences, including consumer preferences, and they have to negotiate for their preferred responses. And often these responses reflect gendered livelihood roles, including men's and women's roles along agricultural value chains. And these responses affect the flow of healthy foods and nutrients throughout the value chain. The chosen response options, such as changes in crop choices or consumption patterns, can alter food environments and diets, and then these have implications for food security and nutrition outcomes. So we use evidence from some systematic reviews as well as case studies from different bodies of literature to illustrate these points in more detail throughout the chapter. To illustrate the relationship between gender and resilience in terms of exposure and sensitivity to shocks and stressors, we draw on the literature on natural disasters. And this literature shows how gender differentiated outcomes like mortality rates vary across context and by type of shock. Women tend to have higher morbidity and reduced life expectancy compared to men following natural disasters like droughts, storms, and earthquakes, but not always. For example, men died at higher rates following Hurricane Mitch in Central America because they were more likely to work in high-risk occupations such as construction. Men's and women's differential exposure is also reflected in the fact that men and women tend to perceive different impacts from climate change and different shocks and stressors. The impacts that they perceive usually relate to their livelihood roles and the resources that they depend on. Exposure also depends on the type of shock. For example, women are more likely to experience gender-based violence and displacement in conflict settings. There are also gender differences in the degree to which men and women are affected by disturbances, that is, their sensitivity. For example, women took longer to recover from the 2008 food price crisis, given more acute impacts on their food insecurity and a decrease in their productive capital. And to bring in a food systems lens, we highlight that men and women living in different food environments may be differently exposed and sensitive to disturbances. For example, men and women in urban areas may be more exposed to supply chain disruptions given greater reliance on imported foods. There are many different determinants of men's and women's resilience capacities. In the paper, we focus on those aspects that are particularly relevant for food security and nutrition outcomes. In general, the literature suggests that women tend to have more limited resilience capacities due to several factors. For example, women's lack of access to productive resources like land can limit their ability to adopt agricultural practices that increase resilience, like tree planting. Women's more limited ability to earn and control income through employment and entrepreneurship may reduce the household's ability to cope with unexpected shocks, given that women contribute to household budgets and tend to allocate income towards consumption and other basic household needs. Women's more limited access to services, like information and financial services, can also limit their ability to manage shocks and stresses through measures like borrowing to smooth consumption or adopting climate-smart practices. Women also tend to have a higher work burden and may be more reluctant to take up some response strategies that have implications for their workload. Or they may take on additional work, but this may come at a cost to time spent preparing food or caring for children, which can also have negative outcomes. Intra-household dynamics also shape responses to shocks and stressors. Because men and women, even within the same household, have different preferences, interests, and roles, they both have important contributions to make to increasing resilience. Women's preferences for how they respond to shocks and stressors are often reflective of their livelihood roles. So for example, women may be more likely to adopt climate-smart practices like livestock feeding or improved post-harvest processing practices that are aligned with their roles and that allow them to control the benefits such as income and reduce their time burden. However, because resources are limited, women must negotiate for their desired responses in multiple spaces, from the household to the community to other groups or governing bodies. Women tend to have less bargaining power in all these spaces, which has implications for the response options that are ultimately chosen and the outcomes of those choices. The choices that are made following shocks and stressors have implications for gender differentiated outcomes along several pathways. And there are lots of pathways, but we focus on a few examples that have implications for food security outcomes. For example, changes in production choices, like diversification of production, can affect the supply of foods, food access, and diets. Changes in income and who controls income also affects food security, diets, and nutrition outcomes given gendered expenditure preferences. Whose assets are drawn down or built up following shocks or stressors has implications for men's and women's bargaining power and future resilience capacities. A lot of response options have implications for labor allocation. For example, some studies show that certain climate-smart practices like conservation agriculture can increase women's time burden in some contexts. On the other hand, adoption of labor-saving technologies like irrigation pumps may free up women's time. And there may be trade-offs across these outcomes as well as over time. For example, responses that increase food production and household incomes may have negative implications for some aspects of women's empowerment or gender equality if they increase women's time burden or shift greater control over income to men. Policies and interventions outside the household also influence capacities, choices, and outcomes. But interventions are not always responsive to gender differentiated capacities and preferences. More resources are being applied to improve gender and social inclusion in resilience programming, to increase women's economic empowerment, and to transform social norms. Some of these promising interventions include things like efforts to close resource gaps, such as women's access to land or water, building women's assets, group-based approaches such as working through women's self-help groups, and social protection programs that are targeted to women. The most appropriate interventions, as well as the approach to implementing those interventions, depends on the context and the challenges and opportunities that women in that context may face. So in conclusion, context matters a lot. Not all disturbances have the same effect, and men and women have different roles in different places. So developing gender-sensitive interventions requires identifying gender-differentiated risks, differences in exposure and sensitivity, in resilience capacities, and in preferences before interventions are designed and implemented. It also requires monitoring gender differentiated outcomes as interventions are carried out and in order to close gender gaps. I want to reiterate that men and women do have important contributions to make to improving food security and increasing resilience to climate change. For example, having diversified livelihood roles and different sources of income can spread risk and minimize the impact of disturbances. And therefore, gender responsive approaches that maximize men's and women's contributions can improve a range of well-being outcomes. Thank you so much, and I hope you'll join us for our live session.